Welcome on the GospelSpice Podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. GospelSpice is your Christ-centered podcast infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture, guaranteed to spice up your relationship with God. I'm your host, Stephanie Roussel, and here is today's episode. So, Joel Rosenberg, welcome on the GospelSpice Podcast.
Hi, I'm so honored, Stephanie. Thank you for inviting me.
I was just telling you before we got started that when we started the GospelSpice podcast just 2 years ago, this is one of our 2 anniversary episodes. You were on my list of dream guests. So it's kind of a dream come true to have you today. What I love about you in particular, there's so many things, but one of them is your very unusual story as an American, but also with a very unusual name. Joel Rosenberg tells a lot about your roots, and you are currently living in Jerusalem. So what is that like?
Well, happy to share the story, Stephanie, and I love this whole concept of gospel spice, and I hope this is spicy, and we'll see how spicy we get. But listen, I yes, I have a unique story in a sense that my father is Jewish, born and raised in the United States, but he's a first-generation American. His parents and grandparents and great-grandparents all born in Russia as Orthodox Jews. He has some German Jews in his family as well, but the family story is that they escaped out of Minsk, Belarus, White Russia, around in several cohorts, but around 1906-07, because of the pogroms, because the Tsar was fomenting horrific anti-Semitic attacks against Jews. Over 60,000 Jews were murdered during this time. Many were raped, beaten, their homes taken over or destroyed, their possessions stolen. And so my family was able to escape by the grace of God. And rather than settle in Central Europe, in Germany and Austria, wherever, as many Jews from Russia did, somehow, and again, by the grace of God, they ended up moving across Europe, getting on a steamship, coming to the United States. And like any good Jewish family, they set up shop in Brooklyn. And that's where my father and his older brother were born and raised. Now, my father was raised in an Orthodox Jewish culture, but it didn't take. For a number of reasons. You can pull on those threads if you want, but the point is there wasn't a lot of love in my father's home, none really, not just from his parents, but also he didn't have any for his parents. And it was just a bad situation. No love in the synagogue, no love in the streets of Brooklyn. It was a rough period of time. And so my father went as far away as he could, which was California, the promised land, Southern California. And he studied to become an architect. Then he got his first job as an architect back in New York State, in Syracuse, New York. And the apartment complex he moved into, he met a young Gentile girl who is eventually going to be his wife, eventually going to be my mother, a graduate student studying French and English to be a teacher of both.
I like her.
Yeah, oui. And so I like to say, because I only took a little bit of French, j'ai étudié français pour 4 années dans l'école secondaire, mais je ne remember much pas. So I did study for a few years in high school, but really it didn't take. So anyway, they met, they fell in love. They were both agnostics. My mom's not Jewish. She's from a Gentile background, and she was from a Methodist background. She has Methodist circuit riding, gospel preaching missionaries in her heritage, but the gospel never reached her. It never connected to her. And so she was lost. My father was lost, but they fell in love in 1965. They got married, had me in 67, and they were on a real journey. So again, not to go into all that detail, but in 1973, my mother very dramatically and beautifully came to faith in Jesus Christ. And it was very exciting to her. And then about 6 months later, after studying the gospel according to Luke, my father came to faith in Jesus as Messiah. Now, honestly, Stephanie, he thought he was the first Jew since the Apostle Paul believed that Jesus is the Messiah. He had never met a Jew who'd believed that. He never even heard of a Jew who believed that. And in 1973, there weren't that many.
And I can actually relate, because I came to faith here in the US as a foreign exchange student from France, and I was convinced I was the very first French Christian ever. I had never met one, so I can so relate to your dad.
Yeah. Well, and it takes a lot of courage to make that decision and to think there's nobody like me, because you're swimming against your culture, and particularly in the Jewish culture, which of course is the first culture to whom, right, the Messiah came, yes, and the first culture to reject him, right? John chapter 1, he came to his own, but his own received him not. And so that the worst thing that can happen in Judaism, in the Jewish culture, is to be cast out of the society. And then you see it in the biblical times. If somebody was a murderer, or if they weren't executed, which there were capital crimes, but if they weren't, they were cast out of the community, banished forever. And that was just a horrifying thing, because there wasn't like a lot of other communities that you could attach yourself to. So it's one of the worst things to feel that you are going against your culture. So anyway, I say all that because my parents we were very excited in the early 1970s to come to faith in Jesus. I came to faith at the age of 8 in 1975. It took a few years through high school to kind of wrestle it through for myself. And then I went to Syracuse University and studied filmmaking, and met this lovely young Gentile girl, but who was an English creative writing major and a Jewish studies minor, Lynn Myers, and she and I fell in love. We met in a campus ministry, and just fell in love, and got married in 1990. And so, but the course of our lives, moving to Washington, D.C., being involved in politics, having 4 sons and raising them in the Washington, D.C. area, being a Jewish believer in Jesus, having the name Joel Rosenberg was very distinctive, and it caused a lot of people to ask a lot of questions, and understandably. And we had a great love for Israel and the Jewish people and her neighbors. Lynn's sister married a Lebanese Arab evangelical, and that was wonderful because now we had a neighbor as a brother, not just in law, but in Christ, right? And we had very dear friends from France who ran a very large international ministry to Arabs, to Muslim background believers, or to Muslims who weren't yet believers, and certainly to Arab Christians and other Christians. And they were beloved to us, and they really taught us a lot about, they didn't think they were doing it, but God was teaching us through that couple that God certainly, we believed intellectually and theologically that God loves Israel and her neighbors, but we were meeting people who had a wide scope of what God was doing in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in the Persian-speaking world. And we got excited that, wow, look at what God is doing all through this region. I would have thought that the Muslim world was the last frontier of the gospel. And I came to realize through that couple and a number of other believers that we met over time from the region, no, the Muslim world is the penultimate frontier. Really, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel, is the last frontier. We are both the Alpha and Omega of ministry, because he came to his own. We didn't receive him, but the book of Romans tells us that all Israel at the end will get saved. So what happens in between? Long story short, we moved to Israel in 2014, exactly 7 years ago this week, as you and I record this. And it's been challenging, but exciting.
Tell us about what it is like to live in Israel today, because I love how you're saying you have a passion for Israel and her neighbors. And we're going to see, later you and I will talk about 2 websites that you have launched, All Israel News, All Arab News, where you really focus on the region, not just from an Israeli perspective, which I love because you bring this unique glimpse into for evangelical Christians primarily into what it's like to be a force for reconciliation between Israelis and Arabs, which again, biblically, these are two of the enemies. I love how you're saying Israel is the ultimate frontier. It is. Jesus told us so. And it's fascinating to see. I hope you will tell us a little bit about the state of the church in Israel today. How many believers are there? Is it growing? I hear it is. Tell us a little bit more. And then what are you doing in Israel today? What is it like? And what is it like for Lynn? As a Gentile myself, I'm curious to see what it's like for a Gentile to live in Israel today. So a lot of questions. You are such an amazing storyteller. Just run with it.
Okay, but I'm going to try. But you just asked all the questions that will lead us to the end of the program. So I'm going to give you shorter answers that, and you'll have to pull on the threads if you want to go deeper, because everything you just said, all right, give me an hour, I'll answer the questions. Okay, so in a few bursts, it is a fascinating and very challenging place to live, the modern state of Israel, right? The Bible says, can a nation be born in a day? Apparently, the answer is yes. May 14th, 1948, to Israel, that's Independence Day. To the Palestinian Arabs and to the rest of the Arab world, it's known as Al-Nakba, the catastrophe or the disaster. So just in that, you see two entirely different views of one place. The modern state of Israel is intriguing because when you first get there, I think many Westerners see it as a first world country. It's got a very rapidly growing economy. It's got a high-tech economy. It's got beautiful cities and constant construction. We joke that the national bird is the crane, but by that we mean the construction cranes that are everywhere building beautiful hotels and high rises. And so you think, oh, okay, this is a place I know. The longer you're there, you realize that's a part of the culture, but Israel is a melange. It is a sort of bubbling stew of lots of flavors and lots of spices, lots of cultures, because Jews, according to the prophecies and according to what's actually happened over the last 100 years, have been streaming in to settle in the land of Israel from every nation on the planet, from all over. We have Asian Jews that look Chinese because for centuries they were living in China, right? We have Ethiopian Jews that are Black. And you think, how are these Jews? They are. And so they've come back. They're called Falasha Jews. We have Jews from Brazil and Jews from Spain and Jews obviously from North America, but all over the world. And that's great for our intelligence services because you can all be recruited and trained and deployed. And it's been good for us. We have Jews who speak Arabic they are not learning Arabic. They are from Iraq. They're from Yemen. They're Persian speaking. They're from Iran. They're from, some of the Farsi speaking Central Asian countries. They speak Turkish because they are Turks or they are Persians or they are Iraqis, whatever. And it's fascinating. They're not like going to school and say, I want to learn to speak Turkish. No. They're Turkish speaking. They know the culture. They know all those nuances, all the spices. They have that. It would be great for the gospel if Israel knew Jesus, because if you think about Israel being a light to the nations, we have a culture that as more and more Jews in Israel come to faith, they have the potential to know how to go back and reach other countries with the gospel. That's only just beginning. The church is only just starting to grow in Israel, and it doesn't have much of a vision yet of global missions. That's starting to happen, but it's a very fledgling church. So now a couple of the details of living in Israel. Talk about aromatic alleyways. If you go to the old city, right, that is built on top of all the old cities of Jerusalem in the past, including the one that Jesus walked through, that the disciples, you feel as you walk through these aromatic alleyways that Jesus and his disciples could walk around the corner at any moment. There are goats, there are sheep, there are every type of spice you could possibly want, and when I say aromatic, I'm not kidding. You know you're coming to the old city before you get there because you can smell it, and then the taste and the foods and Israeli cuisine. I would not say is my ultimate. You can. There's very few dishes that you can eat. That's Israeli. We think of falafel and hummus, but that's really Arab.
Lebanese, yeah.
Lebanese, for example. Yeah, great Lebanese food in Israel. There's a lot of different dishes that are Moroccan. We have a lot of Moroccan Jews. And of course, Morocco just normalized relations with Israel in the recent weeks. Direct flight from Tel Aviv to, I forget if it was Casablanca or Rabat, but anyway, might have been Marrakesh. But anyway, like it's moving. I think there's 300,000 Israelis who are Moroccan descent. That's a lot. So it's exciting. But a lot of the foods that we have and a lot of our culture that we think of now as Israeli are really the cultures that Jews brought back, or our local Arabs. I mean, there's 20% of Israel are Arabs. I mean, Arabs, Muslims, or Christians, but they're citizens of Israel. They can vote. They can have political parties. They have, I don't know, 13 or 14 seats in the parliament. There are Arab Israeli Supreme Court justices. You hear the criticism of Israel that it's an apartheid culture. It's not at all. Arabs can buy land, own land, start a mosque, be a preacher, go to school. They don't have to serve in the army, but they can. Most don't. They can serve there. They serve at the heads of banks and in our police forces. And I'm not saying everything's cozy always. There are strains, but it's not a legal or even cultural divide. It's a divide that comes from tensions from Jews leaving Arab cultures, escaping them to come to Israel and being hostile or at least suspicious towards other Arabs because of their experiences, and vice versa and so forth. So fascinating place to live. And boy, you hear every type of language and every type of accent. And so we find it fascinating, but it's not America. There are elements of America, there are elements of Paris and London and Rome and Berlin, but there are elements of Baghdad and Tehran and Sana'a and Beirut and Casablanca and you think Cairo, and you think, wow, and Bangkok and Beijing and Buenos Aires and Rio, and you think it's a lot to process, and it's a rough culture.
Very fittingly, you have shared somewhere I read when you said that the first time you went to Israel, I think as a college student or when you were young, you were one of the key impressions you had of Israel is that it was, I quote, the epicenter of the world. And that's exactly what you're describing right now. The fact that all of the nations are coming together to Israel. First, I think it's deeply biblical. There's a huge element of fulfilled prophecy to that. And the fact that it is truly today, even more maybe the epicenter than it was 20 or 30 years ago, increasingly so. So what does that mean that Israel is the epicenter, maybe politically, but also obviously for you, even as a family today? So on all those levels, what does it mean?
Sure. Well, first of all, I actually wrote a book in 2006 called Epicenter that looks at the nation of Israel and the prophecies, but also all that's been going on for the last 100 years or so. And what are the prophecies still coming? What are the headlines that we will read one day in the press? And Epicenter was my first nonfiction book and one of the best-selling books I've ever written. And that term, is a geological term. It has nothing to do really with the Middle East, but it's become a term that I hear about among Christians in the media a lot over the last 15 or 20 years since I wrote it, 15 years, because I think epicenter does capture the sense of it. Long story short, epicenter technically is a geological term that means the point on the earth above which an earthquake emanates from, right? All that energy starts radiating out to shake the earth. The point that you would identify on the earth where it's sort of the genesis of that that earthquake, that's called the epicenter. Why do I use that term? I use that term because Israel is increasingly the epicenter of the momentous events that are shaking our world and shaping our future. Now, biblically, the Bible describes Israel as the center of the earth. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 5, you see a verse that talks about, I think it's 5 verse 5. It says that God has set Jerusalem at the center of the nations, and all the other lands are around it. So God could have put, Washington, D.C., where I'm speaking to you from now, that could be the center of the world. And of course, if you live in Washington and you're an American, most people think it is the center of the world, but not according to God. If you live in Beijing and you're Chinese, you think that's the center of the world. And it is for them, but it's not for God. Jerusalem is, the nation of Israel is. We see it again in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 38. I think it's verse 12 or 14. I don't have it at my fingertips at the moment. I should know this, but it's been a few years since I talked about the book. God says, he's going to draw all the Jews back from around the nations where he'd scattered them in exile and bring them back to the center of the earth. And the term God uses in Hebrew is the belly button of the earth, or the navel of the earth. And there are other examples in scripture of that. So that's geographically, God sees it as Israel, Jerusalem, that's the center. And then everything else is important, but it's in relationship to Israel and Jerusalem. And if you look at almost any geographical reference, the king of the north, the queen of the south, all the kings of the east, when you see these things, they're all related to north of Jerusalem, east of Jerusalem, south of Jerusalem. But there's also the spiritual side, right? In the book of Acts, Jesus is asked by the disciples, hey, is this the time that you're going to restore the sovereign geopolitical nation state of Israel, the kingdom of Israel? And Jesus has just been teaching them about the kingdom for 40 years, but he doesn't say, oh my gosh, you guys, you've got to be kidding me. We're done with Israel. Enough of Israel. It's never going to happen, gentlemen. No, he says, no, this is not the time to talk about that now. I'm not going to tell you the time. Your job is not to focus on the sovereignty of political Israel. Your job is to focus on taking the good news of God's love for humanity and the story that the Messiah has actually come, died, risen again, and take that gospel spice to the world, right? Get people to taste and see that the Lord is good, right? That's what he's trying to say. And what does he say? You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and even to the very ends of the earth, the 112 nations that the GospelSpice podcast is being heard in right now. And so that shows us that the church's birth was in Jerusalem, right? Where the resurrection, the crucifixion, resurrection, Pentecost, birth of the church, spread of the gospel, all starting in Jerusalem. And then finally, what's the last city ever mentioned in the Bible? In the book of Revelation, it's Jerusalem. So the gospel message and history starts from Jerusalem and spreads outbound to the ends of the earth, like the United States, China, but it turns around in the last days and it comes back. And that's why you're seeing the rebirth of the state of Israel. That's why you're seeing so much focus on the nation of Israel, the state of Israel, the people of Israel. There is both the church and the world is like, this didn't even exist for almost 2,000 years. And now, wow, it's back and it's big and it's a regional superpower. Mm-hmm. So, and I'll let you pull on this thread. I won't keep going, but you asked me about the growth of the church. Yes, for the first time in 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years, we are seeing Jews coming to faith in Jesus in dramatic numbers.
And that is beautiful.
And now, a brief message from GospelSpice.
Have you ever considered that Stephanie is available to speak to your group or at your event? She's currently booking speaking engagements both in person and virtual for the next 12 to 24 months. Stephanie speaks on a variety of topics, from scripture study to seasonal events and so much more. You can even book the GospelSpice team to provide a more in-depth conference experience. If you follow Gospel Spice, then you know our desire is to inspire everyone to taste and see the wonderful spices that the gospel has to offer. Go to gospelspice.com/speaking for details.
Now, back to the video.
I love how poetically you've described the biblical truth that Jerusalem is the apple of God's eye and is the center of the earth, and how God has gone all around the world and comes back to Jerusalem, and how a biblical understanding as Christians, whether we are Gentile or Jew, a biblical understanding of God's timing obviously is goes through a biblical understanding of the role of Jerusalem, and therefore, as believers, positioning ourselves with Jerusalem and viewing history, past, present, and future, in light of the history of Israel and Jerusalem in particular. And that takes us to the book that you are promoting right now, Enemies and Allies, which, as we are recording, has not been released yet, but I have had the privilege of reading the first 5 chapters, and it's on pre-order, and it's phenomenal, because what you are helping us Gentiles, Western Gentiles by and large, do is understand who are the enemies and allies. That's the title of the book, The Enemies and Allies of Jerusalem. And giving us a biblical understanding, even though it's not necessarily written only for a Christian audience. Tell us, in a nutshell, why does Jerusalem have enemies and allies? And how are you helping us today, in the fall of 2021, understand the world we're living in through that lens?
Sure. Well, 20 years ago, next month, September, was the horrific attacks of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, the attacks on the World Trade Centers in New York, on the Pentagon in Washington, and of course, the plane that was probably headed either to the White House or the Capitol building, but was courageously taken down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, by the passengers who realized they were being hijacked, but also called friends and family, and they told them, this is not a classic hijacking. You're not going to land in Cuba and be traded for hostages or arms or money or whatever. They're going to kill you. They're going to fly into a building, and that group of people, led by an evangelical Christian, Todd Beamer, said, we gotta try to take this plane back. Whether we're successful or not, I don't know. But we're going to die one way or the other. We better protect our capital, protect our country. Deeply moving. That's 20 years ago. And the big question that I started in writing Enemies and Allies was, well, 20 years later, where are we? Americans were not prepared for. Most Americans were not, had no idea that we were in a battle with radical Islamism. And I don't mean all of 1.8 billion Muslims, but I'm talking about a subset. Most social science tells us between 7 and 10% of the Islamic world believes that using violence to achieve political or religious objectives is good, is acceptable, is approved. 7 to 10%, and that's dozens and dozens and dozens of surveys from different angles in multiple Muslim countries. So the point is, it's true when people say the vast majority of Muslims in the world are not violent. They're not trying to hijack a plane and fly it into a city or a building or blow themselves up in a cafe or a supermarket or whatever. That's true. Vast majority don't want that. But 7 to 10%, I mean, if you take a world of 1.8 billion people and you say 10% believe in it, doesn't mean they're all going to do it, but they support it, they believe in it, they promote it, they approve it, they might fund it, they might send their sons and daughters to be part of it. 10% of 1.8 billion people is 180 million people. That's well over half the population of the United States. If you put all those people in their own country, the Islamic Republic of Radicalistan, it would be the 9th largest country on the planet. So it's true that the vast majority of Muslims are not our enemies, but it's also true that 180 million people perceive themselves as our enemies, not just of Jerusalem, but of the United States, of Western civilization, of Christianity, of Judaism, and in many cases of other forms of Islam that they don't agree with.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. And so Americans were blindsided on September 11th, 2001 by an enemy they didn't understand, by an evil they didn't understand. And one of the themes, Stephanie, in my writings, both as a writer of political thrillers, but also nonfiction books like Enemies and Allies, is this: to misunderstand the nature and threat of evil is to risk being blindsided, right? December 7th, 1941, Americans were blindsided by Imperial Japan. We did not understand how much they hated us. We did not understand that they intended to come and do a kamikaze attack at Pearl Harbor. We didn't think that it was even possible. Even if they wanted to do it, they're all the way over there. How could they? We didn't believe that they could get to us. And of course, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt very famously says, December 7th is a day that will live in infamy. We were blindsided by it, though. When you look back, you can see there's a lot of data that told us this was coming, but we didn't see it, we didn't believe it. And 9/11 was similar. So the book looks at, 20 years later, who are our enemies, especially in the Middle East? That's where I'm focusing. And who are our allies? Because a lot of it's changing. Al-Qaeda is not the enemy that it was 20 years ago. And we would have said a week ago that Taliban was not the threat that it was 20 years ago when it ran Afghanistan. Unfortunately, President Biden is in the process of pulling all U.S. forces out of Afghanistan. And I say unfortunately because the country's collapsing, the Taliban is rapidly taking over. And it's very likely that by the time people listen to this podcast, the people of Afghanistan will be completely enslaved again by a radical Islamist, terrorist, barbaric organization known as the Taliban. And that's after 20 years of fighting and hundreds of millions of dollars and, 2,700 Americans soldiers and, intelligence operatives' lives lost. We just surrendered it. So the book looks at what is really going on. And the Taliban is a problem, but it's not our major threat. Iran is the major threat because it's a whole industrial modern country, and it has a military, and it has oil, and it has gas, and it has allies like Russia and Turkey and China and North Korea, all of which hate us. Turkey's moving that way. And it's trying to get nuclear weapons, and it's threatening to wipe Israel and the United States off the map.
And now, a brief message from GospelSpice.
Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Merci. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel and click that bell icon so you are the first to know when we release a new video or episode. Also, would you please consider helping us reach new people with the good news of the spice of the gospel by leaving a 5-star review for the GospelSpice podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, iTunes, Google, etc. Finally, share and follow us on social media to spread the word of GospelSpice. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in our podcast with new episodes every Friday. I'll see you in our next video very soon, right here. Merci.